Hi, I'm Ken Harvey. Photography is a form of fine art that rivals other forms of fine art, such as painting, etchings, charcoal drawings, even 3D art such as sculpture. A lot of people might not think that photography can be a form of fine art, but I'll show you in a moment why that really is the case. And it's certainly more than the press of a button. Today we'll talk about forms of photography, some of the myths surrounding photography, and there are many, the overlap of photography and other forms of art, and I will mostly compare it to painting. Now this is not meant to be anything derogatory about painting. I'm just using painting as a simple way to compare photography to other forms of visual art. I love painting. I love painters. They do something I can't do. We'll look at some of the challenges facing the photographer and some of the steps in producing art from a raw photograph. Now, I'll leave it to other people to decide whether my work is art or it isn't. It's all the eye of the beholder, but I'll show you how I can produce what I call a finished product from a raw photograph. Some of the forms of photography. And now these are in decreasing order of restriction. First is documentation. If you're documenting something, you can't change anything. If it's a crime scene that you're documenting, it would be really a mistake to maybe erase a cigarette butt that was laying on the floor. Photojournalism. I know that some photojournalists have been in trouble for doing something like removing a telephone pole that was in the distance that was distracting from the photograph. And also passport photos. You don't want to go try to change a passport photo. Nature photography is a little less restrictive. If you're trying to do actual nature photography, and we're not talking about art where you might have a green owl, the item, the plant, the bird, the animal that you're photographing has to look like that animal. It has to be representative. Now, can you do little things? Can you take out that telephone pole that's in the distance? Sure, nobody really cares. Commercial photography is even less restrictive because you've all seen these models that have the nice white in the eyes, the teeth look just perfect, the skin is flawless. The models don't really look that way, but it's okay, we consider, to like pretty it up a little bit. Same thing with advertising, showing a product placement somewhere. And weddings. Can you imagine that you're doing a wedding and photographing a wedding, and the bride comes in, has a big red mark on the end of her nose. Not only is it okay to try to fix that little spot on her nose, but it's pretty much required. We have snapshots, family photos. If you wanted to show grandma riding a buffalo, that's fine. Nobody really cares. And we have art. There aren't any restrictions in art. Art, it's wide open. So what is art? That's not a discussion for today. Eye of the beholder, of course. Different people have different ideas on what can be art. And what are the rules for making art? There are no rules. There's one little rule that people talk about called the rule of thirds. This is just a convenient way to compose a photograph or an image. It could be a painting. You basically divide up the image into thirds, top to bottom, left to right. Where those lines intersect is where the focus of the photograph or the image should be. Now, this is a photograph that kind of goes with the rule of thirds, and I'll show you on the next slide. I've divided it up with these lines. Now, where these black lines intersect, you can see in the lower right-hand corner, that's really the focus of this image. Does it have to be that way? No, it certainly doesn't. In fact, I went through a lot of my photographs to find ones that would really illustrate the rule of thirds, and I didn't find many. In fact, this one was trimmed down just a little bit so I could make a point. What are the popular myths? This is the great one. All a photographer has to do is press a button. If I had known it was that easy, I would have started photography 45 or 50 years ago. As a matter of fact, I did. Photography is not art, and that's one that will cause a lot of arguments. I know people who have come close to losing friends discussing whether or not photography is or is not art. The quality of photography is directly related to the camera equipment. No, you can't buy your way into fine photography. I've had people say, "Oh, I love that photograph. You must have a great camera." But you wouldn't go up to a painter and say, "I love that painting. You must have great brushes." It doesn't really matter. Here's a popular one. Now that phones can take photographs, everybody is a photographer. Far from it. We all have pencils, but we don't all call ourselves writers. Modifying an image, whether in a dark room or on a computer, is cheating. In fact, modifying an image is almost required. The camera doesn't see things the way we see them, and it certainly doesn't come out the way we remember a situation. We might remember something quite different than what the camera sees, and we have to work with that to bring it back to reality. If you depict something that's not completely factual, you're cheating. And I'll show you some wonderful cheats a little later on. Not photographers necessarily, but artists, and we'll see that modifying or depicting something that's not completely factual is really fine. If you create your art on a computer, you're cheating. I can just imagine a rejection notice coming to William Shakespeare. "Dear Mr. Shakespeare, I'm sorry, we can't use your play Romeo and Juliet, although it's very nice, because you typed it on a computer instead of using a quill pen." The camera sees what we see. Not at all. The camera is no more a replacement for the human eye than a robot is a replacement for a human. So let's talk about pressing the button. In general, a photographer has to start with a photograph of an actual scene. It can't be created. If you want a scene of a sunrise from a mountaintop, you have to either sleep on that mountaintop overnight or climb up in the dark in order to see the sunrise. If I were painting it, I could paint it any way I wanted. I didn't have to have that recording in my camera. Before a photographer presses a button, there's a lot that goes into the composition, the determination of how this scene is going to look when it is recorded in the camera. And it comes with visualizing the scene. A good photographer can look around and without looking through the camera can see mentally how something is going to look once he puts the camera on it. And if you can tell a story with an image, that's even better. Not every piece of art has to tell a story, but if you can tell a story, that takes it to a higher level. A photographer needs to control a lot of things in the camera, and I'm sure that there are plenty of people out there with a new camera that aren't really sure how to use it. Certainly you can use the automatic settings, and this works very well in, let's say, 90, 80% of the time. When you're dealing with a good lighting situation, certainly midday, the camera is going to do a good job. But if you have low light or you're trying to capture motion, let's say there's a halfback running down the sideline, you can't just take a snapshot because that halfback is probably going to be blurred and the people standing behind him will be in focus. So you have to pan with the runner. And I'll show you a photograph here. This is a picture of a race car. It happens to be Jackie Stewart, 1968 German Grand Prix. In pouring rain, but I panned with the car so that the car is in focus, but the background is blurred, and that gives you the feeling of motion. If I had just had the camera stationary, all those trees in the background would have been fine, but the car would have been a blur. So that's how you can create the sensation of speed. And in a moment, we'll see some of the steps that a photographer has to go through in order to create from a raw photograph. Photography is not art. Certainly not all photographs are art, but certainly not all paintings are art. If I did an oil painting, I could pretty much guarantee it wouldn't be art. A painting or a photograph that's a portrait, for example, can be an accurate representation. It can be technically great, but it can also be art. And we'll look at some documentation later that is also art. And to merely capture an image is not art. It all goes to the lighting, the composition, whether you can tell a story, which is very nice, the expression of a concept, the control of the depth of field, and many other factors. Depth of field may be a new concept to some people, but depth of field is how much from front to back is in focus when you're taking a photograph. If you use a wide-angle lens, a lot will be in focus. If you use a telephoto, you'll have a very short depth of field. Sometimes this can be used to your advantage to have the subject in focus, the background out of focus. It makes the subject look even more sharp. The quality of photography is directly related to the quality of the camera equipment. Ted Williams was one of the best batters in baseball. Do you think he had a better bat? No, it was a piece of wood. If his bat had been so special, everybody would have had one like it. Actually, they probably did have one like it, but couldn't do the same work with it. So if it were really just the equipment, everybody would go out and get the very best equipment and have the very best photographs. But I've seen people take photographs with a $100 camera, and they were wonderful photographs. It all comes from the heart and the mind. It's not from the equipment. Can having the right equipment make it better, make better art? Yes, it can. And here's a good example. This is Vermeer's Girl with a Pearl Earring. Now, you couldn't do this with a 3-inch brush from Home Depot. Aside from having the great composition, great lighting, there's a finesse in the painting that you couldn't get with a big brush. And then sometimes the quality of the brush is completely irrelevant. This is Willem de Kooning's Gotham News. This is considered art by some people. I'm not one of those people, and you might say, well, you need more education in contemporary art, and that might be the case. Good equipment is as helpful as having good brushes. It can do something for you that maybe you couldn't have done otherwise. Let's say having a wide-angle lens or a telephoto lens. It might help you get a scene that you might not have been able to get, but it won't make art. When Claude Monet painted his wonderful canvases, he was nearly blind. Well, in later years, he was nearly blind. And when you see them from 15 or 20 feet away, you think there's a lot of detail in them. But when you get up close, there's no detail. It's like looking at a half-tone photo in a newspaper with the little black and white dots. When you get close, you can't really see it. But his genius was in getting these blobs of paint, these smears, to all come together and make a wonderful scene. We did talk about that you cannot buy your way into great photography. It's really the case. If I had a really, really expensive camera, I don't think my work would be any different. I really don't. And as I say, you can get different equipment that can help you do certain things. You can get an infrared camera, let's say, that will see light in a different wavelength than we can see with the human eye. But that, again, is not going to make art. It's only going to give you the ability to do something different. This is the great one. Now that phones can take photographs, everybody's a photographer. With an abundance of pencils, not everybody is a writer. Now, what does it mean to be a writer or a photographer? Well, if you tell somebody you're a writer, they assume that you write poetry, novels, something like that. Not that you're able to write with a pen or pencil instead of typing on a computer. So when I tell people I'm a photographer, that doesn't mean I take selfies with my phone. Modifying an image is cheating. That's a popular myth. In fact, as we'll see a little bit later, it's almost required in many situations. If you depict something that's not completely factual, you're cheating. And if you create art on your computer, you're cheating. I don't see how there can be a difference between creating art in a dark room and creating art on a computer. It's the result that counts. Now let's take a look at some famous cheats. And I'm going to start with one of my favorite cheats, Ansel Adams. This photograph is of the Grand Tetons in the Snake River at Grand Teton National Park. Now, in order to take a photograph like this and have it come out looking like this, you either have to use special techniques in the darkroom or even a filter in front of the camera lens as you're taking the photo, which will make the sky darker so that you can expose differently. Now, without a filter, if I were there and exposed for the trees in the foreground, the sky would come out completely white. If I were to expose for the sky, take that from my light reading, the foreground would be completely dark. So, number one, probably have to use a filter of some sort. Number two, in the darkroom or on the computer, you want to darken the sky and lighten the foreground in order to get an image like this. Does anybody really care that Ansel Adams did these things? No, unless you're a photographer, you'd like to know how he did it. But the result is what really counts, and this is the art. Here's another famous cheat. One of my favorite painters, Claude Monet. He did not invent Impressionism, but he did give it its name. This is called Impression Sunrise, and Monet never said this was reality. This is his impression of the sunrise. Certainly the sun doesn't look like that. It doesn't reflect off the water like that. And the whole thing is not really realistic. It is not photographic, so to speak. So this caused a lot of trouble early on. The Impressionists were not well received early on because they were doing something different. However, is this art? Absolutely. One of my favorites is Renoir. And I like to joke that the day that they were teaching eyes when he was going to art school, he only showed up for the first 10 minutes. He learned how to do one kind of eye and then left. All of his ladies have the same eyes. If you look, the same eyes and the same eyebrows. Do I care? Not one bit. Not one bit. Also, this scene is not an actual representation of a moment in time. It's the sense of what was going on to get everybody in the same position. But he was showing the dappled light, the merriment, the people who are happy, well-dressed, having a good time. That's what the art is. Another one of my favorite cheats, Leonardo da Vinci. Now, only a fool would believe that da Vinci was there and painted these portraits. Nobody really knows what these men looked like. Nobody really knows what this room looked like. I doubt that it had this ceiling that looks like a suspended ceiling. Now, this painting, which to me is a wonderful painting, is often used to show how you can use perspective to direct the person's eye. If you look at the lines in the ceiling, the wall, the tops of these tapestries, even the lines on the floor, they all converge onto Jesus' face. In fact, in that window behind him, there's a little sort of an archway which kind of makes a halo around him. Is this a great exhibition of perspective? Yes, it is. Is it a great painting? Absolutely. Now, not only do we not know what the people looked like, but I like to point out, if you had a long, skinny room and a long, skinny table, you probably wouldn't put it sideways and make everybody sit on one side. And if you look in the background, there's really nothing behind there. They have maybe 15 feet behind them, but everybody is squeezed around this table. Now, another point in the visual art is that the blue lines at the end of the table stop that big white blob from being overpowering. It stops the motion of your eye off the canvas. Beautiful painting. Vincent van Gogh, shortly before his visit to the dermatologist. Is this reality? No, it's not. Is this cheating? No, it's not. It's art. Vincent was creating art. Poor Vincent only sold about, I think, one painting in his whole lifetime, and that was either to or through his brother Theo. He certainly was not successful as a painter. I'm sure he'd like to be alive today and reap the rewards. When is it not okay to modify a photograph? When you're doing photojournalism, when you're doing documentation. That's the only time it's not okay to do anything different to a photo. When is it okay? Basically, whenever you want, as long as it's not documentation, and especially when you're creating art. There are no rules when you create art. Now here's a wonderful photograph. This is Joe Rosenthal's photo of the raising of the flag on Iwo Jima, 1945. By far the most famous photograph of 1945. It was used to sell war bonds, and it was just marvelous. It was on postage stamps and everything. Joe didn't even know he had this photo the way he had it at the time, because the men would take their rolls of film and send them off to be developed and printed somewhere else. Somebody in some lab said, hey, we have a winner here. And indeed they did. The composition is wonderful. It's so simple, but it's wonderful. The square composition, we have the nice diagonal, almost a 45-degree angle across. The motion of the men going in one direction, the flag going in the other direction. Great composition. It was very, very successful. Incidentally, the Iwo Jima Memorial in Arlington, Virginia, which basically copies this, is not exactly the same, and I'll show you this. You'll see that the flagpole is a little more vertical and the people are in a little bit different position. Is that a problem? No, it's not. Why is the flag further up? Maybe to make it easier to put the flag up and down, or maybe they use a different photograph, a different similar photograph to copy in order to do the sculpture. There's a form of art called trompe-l'oeil, which is French for fool the eye. Now, I always wonder if trompe-l'oeil is really considered art. Certainly I've seen them in museums, art museums. It's wonderful work. And it's a flat painting that's done in a way that makes you think it's three-dimensional. And I've done this myself. You kind of go up to the canvas and look at it sideways to see if it really is just two-dimensional. Now, is that art? Or is it just good technique? Is that from using good equipment? Or is that really artistic? And I think it's kind of both. I think it's magical to have that vision and be able to take that vision and put it onto canvas. Or usually they didn't even use canvas, uses some kind of a smooth material, whether wood or something else, so you wouldn't have the bumps from the canvas. So is that art? I don't know. Is it using good equipment? Absolutely. Then we have things like Jackson Pollock, also known as Jack the Dripper. Jack didn't need very good equipment to do his work. In fact, sometimes I don't think he even used a brush. He would just splatter paint. Did he make art from it? Yes, this is art. Is it my favorite kind of art? No, it's not my favorite kind of art. It's nice. It's sold for a lot of money. I'd like to be able to have that kind of money, but I don't think I would do that in order to earn the money. Here's another one, Andy Warhol's soup can. If this is considered art, I don't see how anybody can say photography is not art. Now, I'm sure Andy had a really good line, how he's showing the essence of the soup can, that it means something special to the Campbell's Company or whatever. Is that art? I don't think so. Willem de Kooning's Gotham News. We saw that a little bit earlier. Enough said about that. Mark Rothko's whatever. It always looks like a woolly bear caterpillar to me. Is it art? I suppose it is. Is it pleasant? Yeah, I think it's pleasant. I think his composition is very nice. Pretty simple colors, Halloween colors, Harley-Davidson colors, Princeton University colors. Is it art? Sure. Let's take a look at the challenge of photography. A photographer has to be there at the time that something takes place. A painter has the luxury of imagining something and painting it. Last Supper would be a great example. With rare exceptions, a photographer cannot create something that was or is not there. You cannot conjure something up in the camera. Now, can you use computer graphics or certain kinds of design software to make something? Sure. Is that photography? No, it's not. So let's just stick with photography. The composition has to be determined then and there. If you have people sitting around a table and you're taking a picture of them and I don't know, the light is shining on somebody's bald head making a big white spot, that's tough. That's the way it is. Or if you wanted to have something further back than it is, and it wasn't that way, that's the way it happens to be. The settings on the camera must be correct. We have the aperture, we have the shutter speed, film or sensor speed, we have things like white balance, which we'll talk about a little bit further on. So all of these things have to be set ahead of time. Sure, you can use automatic, but that doesn't always work. The exposure of the film or the sensor is only an early start in creating the art. It's the beginning. Ansel Adams said that the negative is the score and the print is the performance. Now, there's an even deeper meaning to that, because when you talk about the score, when a composer is writing a piece of music, they don't just take a bunch of notes and sprinkle it on the paper. They have to think about it and design that music, design if you will, to create something that's enjoyable, that's artistic. And the same thing is true with the photographer. When you're pressing the button, you've already done a lot of work to get things set up the way you want. And also, a camera does not see the way the human eye sees. And I have a little demonstration a little further on to illustrate that. And if something is moving, as I talked about that picture of Jackie Stewart, or the halfback running down the sideline in the football game, if something is moving, you have to pan with it, capture it in the right place, and with the right shutter speed. And the lighting must be right, or you have to control it. If you're doing natural light, which most of my work is natural light, you're at the mercy of the weather. If you're doing something in a dark room, in a studio, you have to set the lights up the right way. And that's a completely different art. That's not as easy as it might sound. So we said that the camera does not see this the way the human eye sees. And okay, we're biological, the camera is mechanical. We see green the best. Green is in the middle of the spectrum. As the wavelengths tail off to the reds and the blues, we don't see them as well as we see the greens. We might think we do because we don't know any better. Now, some animals and insects can see in different wavelengths than we can. I've seen photographs of like a flower, maybe a daisy, which just looks like a plain old daisy to us, but to a bee, it will all be pointing. Their lines on the petals will be pointing to the center where the bee wants to go to get the pollen. Our eyes compensate for light and dark and for color. And this little image on the bottom with the little balloons and the different colors, I'm going to use that to show you how we do compensate. We don't think we do, but it happens. And in taking a photograph, we have to be aware of the ambient light. Daylight tends to be blue in general. Incandescent light inside your home is reddish. Fluorescent light is green. So a photographer either has to adjust for this ahead of time using what they call an 18% gray card, or do it in post-processing. It seems that the best way to do it is ahead of time, but it's hard too. You're not always prepared when things happen quickly. So here's an image I call Roy G. Biv. Roy G. Biv looks like a person's name, but it really stands for red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, the 7 accepted colors of the spectrum. So if you look at this X, I placed a little X right in the middle on the green. If you stare at that for, let's say, 20 seconds, I'll just talk a little bit, and your eyes will get accustomed to those colors. Keep staring at the X. And then when I go to the next scene, stay on the X, you'll see the boxes that were on the left were blue, and the ones that were on the right are yellowish. And I'll go back, I'll do it one more time. Concentrate on the X, your eyes are still kind of set for those colors. There, you see that? And you might have noticed that in the middle is a yellow dot, and that was where that purple balloon was. And the same thing happens with light and dark, which we'll see a little bit further on. So a photographer has to compensate for the mindless recording that's performed by the camera, and must convert that raw image, the negative, what we call the raw image, to make it more realistic, more artistic. I will show you in a moment how I had to modify an image to make it more realistic. So the required modification often requires adjusting the brightness, the contrast, the color cast, as I said, things to be a little brighter or a little less bright, and what we call dodging and burning, which is making parts of the image either a little bit lighter or a little bit darker. Now here's an image that's not very good. When I took this photograph, it looked great to me from my human eye, but as with that photograph from Ansel Adams of the Snake River and the Grand Tetons, if I were to expose for the sky, which I did in this image, the foreground is all black. The next one, a little bit better, a little bit of color in the foreground, but the sky is starting to get too light. And I did one further one, which was lighter in the foreground. Now, when I go to the next image, it's going to look very strange to you at first because your eyes are compensating for the lights and darks here. But I'll go there. Now you see the boat looked a little bit grungy. The grass in the foreground looked a little bit strange, maybe too light. But the longer you look at it, the more your eye gets used to what it really is. Now this is the way I remember the scene because my eyes were compensating for lights and darks. There's something called the blue hour. This is right at dawn, even before dawn, right at dusk, even a little bit after dusk, where there's a lot more blue in the environment that the camera picks up. We don't see it, the camera does. Now you might look at this image, these are mountains, obviously mountains. The very first light of dawn, you have a little bit of the pink in the clouds. Now it's not unusual to see the blue sky, but if you'll notice, the mountains are also blue. This is what we call the blue hour. The next image is one where I learned about the blue hour. This is Mont Saint-Michel in France. When I took this photo, I thought it was going to be a night shot. I went out with the expressed intention of getting a night shot. In fact, trying to get out on this little grassy area in virtual pitch blackness was a little bit scary. I didn't want to fall in the water with my camera. So then I set up the camera on the tripod and took a photo. When I looked at the screen on the back of the camera, I was stunned. I had never seen these colors come out before. This was the blue hour. The camera sees these blues, we don't. And I talked about the rule of thirds here. Here is what some people call a real violation. You never, ever put your horizon in the middle of the image. My horizon is smack dab in the middle. Is it wrong? No, it's not wrong. And I used the little water channel in the foreground to lead the viewer's eye to Mont Saint-Michel, which I will admit is like 1/3 from the right side of the photograph, but with the horizon dead smack in the middle, that's a violation, which it's fine with me. We also have the golden hour. Now, the golden hour is just after the sun comes up or just before the sun goes down. We get the golden look in the scenery. We get the dramatic shadows. It just looks a whole lot better than in midday. This is a moderate photograph. I wouldn't call this art. It's just a pretty photograph. But I wanted to show you how the sky can change from one place to the other and how the low angle of the sun can give you the interesting shadows. Now here's one. I'll show you what the first bit of light can do for you. This lioness was spotted near the road. We were in Tanzania. And just so you know that the next picture is going to be this same lioness, you can like memorize the spots on her belly or look at that broken tree that's just behind her. So this is like an instant before the sun came up, and 5 minutes later we had something that looked like this. Same spots, same broken tree. It makes a huge difference. Also, this is not the golden hour, but this is how you can use dramatic lighting. When we arrived at this pasture, it was completely in shade. The clouds had covered everything. But in that distance over there on the lake, I saw this little bit of sparkling light, and it looked like it was coming our way. So I waited and waited. It seemed like forever. It was probably 10 or 15 minutes. But when that little bit of light got onto the pasture, I got the shot that I wanted. And it was such a low angle that you can see how the mower went around the contours of the hill. Now here's one where it favored the prepared. This man was in Nepal and came to our clinic looking for some water. Somebody gave him water to drink out of this silver bowl, really chrome, not real silver. And fortunately, I had my camera around my neck when he started to drink. Now, he was outside in the sunlight. And when I saw the sun reflecting off the bowl and off the surface of the water onto his face, I was able to grab 3 quick shots. And this is the one I preferred the best. And the background was naturally dark. He was against a stone building that had an overhang, like a porch roof. So the background was dark. And I learned a lot of about dramatic lighting from painting. I love painting, as I said. I've learned a lot of techniques from looking at painting, trying to figure out how different painters were able to achieve different effects. Now, this is Edmund Tarbell's painting called Emmeline, and he has a lot called Emmeline because he was married to Emmeline and she was subject of a lot of his paintings. Now, she's in the sunlight, and the sun just seems more bright than you would think. And what is the secret here? It's because her dress is really blues, greens, and pinks. And where the sun is hitting it, that's where the white shows up. So I was able to use this technique on the next photograph I'm going to show you. Now, this one is called Equus. This is a horse that we happened to see, photograph, but I was taking that lesson I learned from looking at Edmund Tarbell and a few other painters, and I was able to work with the lighting and come up with this. It's certainly one of my most mature compositions. Doesn't follow any of the rules. It's just I felt that's the way it had to be. So that's one of the reasons I like that. Here's how you can tell a story. This is Norman Rockwell's The Runaway. You don't even have to have a title on this to know what's happening. You see the little red pack down at the bottom with the stick in it, and the little boy sitting on the stool in the diner, and the very nice Massachusetts State Patrolman talking to him. Now, we don't know the details. Was he running away, caught by the highway? Was he just going to get a soda before going out on his little jaunt, or what? We don't know the details, but we know what's happening. We know the boy was running away from home, and he's now in protection. So Norman Rockwell now, when people would call him an artist, he would say, no, I'm not an artist, I'm an illustrator. But it was a little bit of modesty on his part, maybe because of the techniques he used for his paintings, but his artistry was in telling the story the way he did. This is my favorite photograph. This is me in 1968. The whole idea behind this was to get dressed up in a suit and tie, shine shoes, and be counting a wad of money, but have the hole in my shoe showing that I was faking it, not making it. As it turned out, I wasn't making it. That $6 that I'm counting was the last $6 that I had, but I did have my camera. So I used a wide-angle lens, a 28mm wide-angle lens, so I could distort the size of the feet. I was going to focus on the feet so that I would be out of focus a little bit. The focus, as I say, on the hole in the shoe. But with a wide-angle lens, as I mentioned earlier, you get more depth of field. So I knew I would be in focus enough that I would be able to tell the story. Here's another one. A woman, not a prosperous woman, outside Van Cleef and Arpels jewelry store, standing there. Now, she is a reflection in the mirror, in the window. The jewels are inside the store, and the cop standing behind her is wondering what these tourists were doing, casing the jewelry store. But I got her to line up so that it looked like she was wearing the jewels, not only on her neck, but around her wrist. I think this tells a little bit of a story, like, hey, wouldn't it be nice to have these? And modifying a raw image. Now here's a photograph I call Sisters, and it's gotten a lot of attention recently. I like the photograph. It's very gentle, and it tells another story about light and dark. I won't get into all of that now. But here's where it started. These two sheep were at the Deerfield Fair, or Topsfield Fair, I forget which it was. Not a very good photograph, but I knew there was something there. I liked the two images of the two heads together, and so I started working with it. Now, the background was junk, so I had to do something, so I started darkening the background. That's a little bit. And I'll just take you quickly through a few steps, and you'll see the little dark line under the sheep's eye disappear in one of these. There it goes. And then that was the finished product. So just to remind you, that's where it started. And this next one, this is, let's call it an Ansel Adams inspired photograph. I would never compare myself to Ansel Adams, who was a master, absolute master. I could barely scratch the surface of his ability. But the black and white landscape, it kind of fits into his style a little bit. Now, here's the photograph I started with. Not a very good photograph. I did get the composition the way I wanted. I had the low trees completely surrounded by the water, so they were completely distinct. Had the tree on the right framing the picture a little bit and breaking up the line of the mountain on the right. So then I wanted to do this in black and white because the color was just terrible. Now, when you convert an image to black and white, you have the ability to say, I want the reds to be whiter or darker, I want the greens to be lighter or darker, I want the blues this way or that way. Now, this picture is mostly blue and green on the top and the right and the bottom, and the left is reddish. So I did this in 2 stages. I did black and white on the blues and greens, and then I changed the red part to black and white. So this is where I started. So then I thought, well, you know, I need to make a little difference on the upper right-hand corner, so I did. I wanted to brighten the tree on the right so that would stand out a little bit better. Brighten the treetops in the foreground, brighten the tree on the right some more. Brighten the foreground, brighten the left side, doing a lot of brightening and darkening. That's mostly what I did with this. Darken the little tree on the left, darken the upper right sky, and then I did what's called edge burning, where this is an old technique in printing where you expose the edges of the paper just a little bit, and it makes them a little bit darker and brings your eye into the middle of the photograph. So here's the edge burn. I'll go back just a little bit so you can see what change was made. There's the edge burn again. And then the next thing I was going to do was darken the upper right sky and add some contrast, and that was my finished product. So starting with a mediocre photograph that had the right composition. Remember I said you have to be in the right place at the right time. So I started with a good composition. Then I was able to use the raw data that was in that negative or the digital negative to make my finished product. And having a vision, I had always wanted to have a photograph of a herd of zebras with all these black and white lines going in different directions and make a black and white photograph of that, very stark black and white photograph. So I did find a herd of zebras. I had to crop it down. Now I did play with this guy in the lower right a little bit, so he looks like his stripes are 3D. But then I started fooling some more, and I came up with this. Now, is this still photography? Yes, it is. Is it graphic design? Perhaps. You know, this is one of those ones where it kind of bleeds between one and the other. It's not pure photography. It's not pure graphic design because it came from a photograph. A few months ago, I was attending a lecture by a man named Lance Heide, who teaches at Northern Essex Community College. Lance Heide did some posters. Now, I find them brilliant in their simplicity. He used only 3 or 4 colors, but you can almost sense, or you can sense, the details that are in there. Like, you could see this white cuff on his right hand. Just looking at that cuff, you know the man is standing there with his hand in his pocket. It's just marvelous. Here's another one by Lance. Now, between the table and the chairs, there's no definition. In fact, the table doesn't even have legs, which doesn't really matter, does it? He's getting the point across that this gentleman is serving up a drink in a fine restaurant. Now, in case you think that my graphic zebras and these posters by Lance Heide are a little bit too modern, let's take a look at the next thing. This is 1892 painting by Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. Basically the same thing. Very few colors, 3, 4 colors, but it was 120 years ago, so 122 years ago. So what we looked at? We looked at the forms of photography. We looked at the myths surrounding photography, and there are many. The overlap of photography and other forms of art, notably painting. And I think you have seen that there is quite a lot of overlap. The challenges facing a photographer, and some of the steps in producing art from a raw photograph. I hope this was instructional and educational, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. If you want to email me, I'm at kenharvey@yahoo.com, or you can look at my website, kenharveyphotography.com. Have a great day. Looking forward to hearing from you. Thanks a lot.